then let's say I'm going to be a lot more productive than I was in the past. And this is the other way that the economy can grow. It can increase its productivity by working smarter or just having a better allocation of resources than they did in the past. And what happened in most of Asia is that the way their economies grow was by intensive growth. They put more inputs into the economy. They put more labor in. They put more energy in. But see, this is why you get stuck in the Malthusian trap, right? Your population can grow, but guess what happens? Your population grows. There's smaller slices of pizza. People become malnourished, and the population then will probably decline as people die from hunger, famine, and various other things that are related to the size of the population. But if you work smarter, if you're more productive, you make investments, the economy is going to be larger in the future. That pizza is going to be bigger. And so even if there's more people, everyone's going to have a larger slice than they would, let's say, and the one that just, let's say, produces more pizza by having more people. So why did these different areas of the world make these choices? Well, let me just start with what was happening in the rest of the world, China, India, Middle East, etc. The first thing is that they didn't have any frontier. By 1500, China had more or less populated most of the arable land in what we know now as China. The Ming Empire extended all the way out toward where Tibet is, to the outer reaches of the Gobi Desert, to the borders of the Himalayas and the Karakoram Mountains, to basically the Amur River in the north, in Manchuria, to Inner Mongolia. There really was nowhere else to go. And they had already put almost all the land they could. All the land was under cultivation already. And they were farming that as intensely as possible. They were putting lots of fertilizer. They were putting the most intensive type of agriculture. They had cut down almost all their forests. And cutting down their forests. And if you ever think of a picture of China with those rivers and those tall bluffs and these kind of like little patches of forest on top of these cliffs, well, that image is because the only place you had forest left in a lot of parts of China was in the places where you couldn't grow any land whatsoever. They literally had taken any land that could have been used for cultivation, including building rice paddies right into like hillsides, had been put under cultivation. And on top of that, they were using about as much fertilizer as you could. And also they were using one of the most intensive growing practices they could. Rice agriculture, which most of Asia was using at the time, produces a lot more calories per acre than, let's say, growing wheat or corn or other types of crops that were more common in Western Europe. So they were producing about as many calories as they could, but they had some problems. The more forest you cut down and put up rice paddies, you run into a problem with energy. In a pre-modern world, your energy is wood, and if you don't have any forest, where is the wood coming from? And so this puts your limit on what you can do, let's say, in terms of how much energy you have to, let's say, promote industrial development or things of that sort. We're really not at the stage where people are having fossil fuels in any large amount. The second thing that they had, and this is true of both India and China, was they had a growing population. And if you have a lot more people, if you want more production, there's a very simple way to do it. More people, more hands, more work. And there's no reason to kind of pursue labor-saving types of innovations. You have so many people that, why make a new invention? Why make a machine? I can just get people to do it. So if you think of things like rickshaws, where these human taxis, where, if you have all these extra people, just use them like animal labor. Have them pull carts. Or, for example, if you want to increase farming output, just put more people out in the fields, planting crops, pulling out weeds, harvesting the rice, etc. And if you've ever seen someone actually have to maintain like a rice paddy, it's back-breaking work. Because you're basically sitting in a pool of water, and on the bottom of this pool is human feces and all their nasty stuff, and you're bent over, it hurts your back, and you got to take each of these rice stalks and stick them right into like the muck at the bottom of these rice paddies. It's not this type of idea where you have the plow, you break open the land, you spray the wheat or corn, and let it grow. Rice takes a lot more effort, but they had a lot more people, and that's how they were making up for and growing their economy. Now the last thing is they didn't have any cheap energy. There weren't lots of fossil fuel deposits available. There wasn't a lot of coal in China or India. And they had basically cut down most of their forests to, let's say, produce enough food to feed their population. And if you don't have forests, you don't have wood, and you don't have wood, you lose your main source of energy, which is biofuels. And so they didn't have the energy to really kind of produce a smarter, more extensive growth economy. Now compare that to, let's say, the West, like England, France, and later North America. Well, the first thing they had is that, remember, China had no frontier. There wasn't additional land to grow crops. But in 1500, you could say a wonderful thing happened for the Europeans. They basically discovered a whole bunch of new land that they didn't know existed before. In other words, North and South America. And the discovery of America and the spread of plantation agriculture, particularly in Latin America, but also in Northern America, where you got sugar plantations and banana trees and cotton and all different crops, you had a lot more land now that you could grow and support that European population. And because of the spread of disease during the Columbian Exchange, a lot of the native peoples of North and South America were wiped out, which means land was cleared through disease, and that made that land available to support the European population and didn't have to support a native population on top of it. The other thing that happened roughly a little bit earlier than this was the bubonic plague. 1/4 to 1/3 of Europe's population just went up and died, which meant you had the same amount of land, but guess what? You had 1/3 less workers, which means we didn't have all these excess workers to put to work and grow the economy by just working harder or putting more people to work. You had to become more efficient, because to maintain, to use the same amount of land and the same amount of other types of resources, you couldn't just put more people to work. You had to figure out a labor-saving technology. And so you had a lot more capital inputs, a lot more money, a lot more machines, and in many ways a lot more innovation. And what you saw coming out of the bubonic plague was this concentration of wealth and concentration of capital in the surviving populations. It broke up some of the traditional social relationships that existed at the time, and allowed Europe to kind of move out of its, out of the high Middle Ages into, let's say, what occurred, the small cities in places like Northern Europe or Northern Italy. You've got a lot of different things were loosed by, let's say, 1/3 of the population dying. I'm not saying let's go have a plague to improve our economy, but it did kind of allow the economy to shift the basis of different resources. And the last one was they did have a lot of cheap new energy sources. For England was sitting on a mountain of coal. And not only that did it have a lot of coal underground, relatively near the surface at the time, they also had a lot of waterways. So the point is that before you have railroads, before you have cars, coal is really heavy. I don't think I need to explain that. They could just take that coal out, dump it onto a barge, and then float it to a city like London. Asia, India didn't really have that option. And so they were able to have more land. They were able to, let's say, shift away from reliance upon just more and more workers to, let's say, more and more, let's say, innovations and capital inputs and money being invested to maintain the land. On top of that, you got a lot of cheap energy. And that allowed it to, let's say, develop in a way that it hadn't in the past. But before I leave here, I just want to talk about a little bit about the organization of an agricultural society. And this chart here is from Ernest Gellner's book called Nations and Nationalism. And this is a very, basic model of an agricultural economy. So let's say before the Industrial Revolution, this is a pretty good chart of what society looked like. And it's basically in two parts. On the top you have these stratified layers. So this would be priests, it would be nobles, it would be soldiers, and it would be merchants. And these were people that traveled to many different places. You had merchants going to fairs, you might have had some long-distance trade, you had the one United Catholic Church at the time in most of Europe, and you also had, let's say, this strata of nobles. But for most people, you were basically, 80% of the population was basically peasants, and you lived in a town, you stayed in that town, and you probably never left it. So even as recently as 100 years ago, my grandmother did travel, did immigrate to the United States, but for most of her life lived in a relatively small valley in the Italian Alps. And born, let's say, in early 20th century, had never seen the valley on the other side of the mountain. Okay, only about 5-10 miles away, but had never seen the valley, even though she, in the interim, had gone to America, raised children in the United States. She had never seen the other valley until she came back to Italy in the 1970s and was able to explore and said, wow, I never knew what this valley looked like, but now she had a car and she could tour. But for the most part, people live within 5 to 10 miles of where they were born, and you probably never left that town. Had no reason to. You were a farmer. Now, imagine this is that you never left your school district. But the only people you could marry were the people in your graduating class. All the food that you consumed was grown locally. Everything, all the goods and services and cheeses and what have you, had to be grown within walking distance of where you grew up, because you don't have a car, you don't have railroads. If you're really lucky, you might have an animal, but basically you didn't really have the ability to move things very far. And so the extent of a market was foot travel 5-10 miles. How many people here have walked 5 to 10 miles? Probably not many. Probably not many of you have ever walked 20 miles. If you're doing that, you're probably preparing for a marathon in this day and age. But that basically meant that you were working in relatively small societies. And you had basically, as I said, this nobility, the clergy, the long-distance merchants on top. But everyone else is basically a peasant. And in this type of society, you really don't need to have money for most people, because peasants are basically just living locally, and there's not a lot of stuff to buy. So basically you're trading, like, I'll give you 4 eggs and you give me 2 chickens, or 2 chickens and I'll give you some bacon from my pig. That's the nature of economic transactions, and because everyone more or less knows everyone else, there's really no need for money. You're like, I'll give you a pig today, and maybe later on you'll give me some cheese and some milk. So you can have those kind of very simple interactions. That's not true for these upper layers here, these vertically stratified horizontal layers, because the nobility needs to collect taxes, and so they need money, right? So they need to have something to raise money. And the clergy, right? The donations to the temple or the church or the monks, those have to be made in money because they're not really producing anything tangible. And you could say the clergy is kind of the forerunner of today's professions. They don't actually make anything. They do things. They maybe make us feel better. And I'm not saying they're not valuable, but they're not valuable in the sense they're giving us tangible, material things in return for services. And so their value is mostly counted in what we might think of as primitive money. And if you think about back to, let's say, the story of Jesus and the money changers in the Bible, you can maybe understand what these money changers were. These money changers were changing, let's say, the things that peasants, and if you think of Israel at the time as a very kind of primitive agricultural society, most people didn't use money. But when they went up to Jerusalem, they had to make their donations or their deposits in the temple. But they didn't have money to do it. And so outside the temple would have been these people with these tables. And in fact, the word banker comes from the Italian word for banca, a table.